one of Canada's most valued natural resources.
To save America.
The focus has turned to our water supply.
Trump threatened to tear up the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Water, already a precious commodity, is increasingly a point of contention between Canada and the U.S.
We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
About diverting Canada's water to the U.S.
Breaking news, Donald Trump unleashes a new demand. Redirect Canada's freshwater.
President Donald Trump has publicly mused.
Water has always been one of Canada's most valuable and essential natural resources. But recently, it has become a flashpoint in a political struggle between the United States and its northern neighbor. What was once a shared understanding of mutual respect and cooperation has turned into a standoff, driven by one person, former President Donald Trump. The stakes are high, as the very resource that has sustained life for millions is now being targeted for exploitation. And in this struggle, Canada's vast freshwater reserves are front and center. At the heart of the issue is Trump's audacious threat to tear up the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, an agreement that has long ensured the health and safety of one of the world's largest freshwater systems. The Great Lakes supply drinking water to more than 40 million Americans, making them vital not only to the people of the region but to the economy as well. But it wasn't just about the Great Lakes. Trump had bigger plans. He made a public statement suggesting the diversion of Canada's rivers, including those feeding into the Columbia River, as a means to ease the crippling droughts plaguing the U.S. The once stable and predictable flow of water from the north to the south now seems to be under threat, with Washington aiming to secure control of these vital resources. For years, the U.S. had enjoyed a kind of unspoken privilege, the assumption that its northern neighbors' resources, including water, would always be available when needed. Trump's comments challenged that assumption head-on. He spoke of Canada's rivers like they were a faucet ready to be turned on and off at will. In his view, water wasn't just a resource, it was a commodity to be traded, controlled, and managed for the benefit of American interests. In the wake of Trump's declaration, the tension escalated quickly. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker turned populist symbol of resistance, stood firm. Canada would not, under any circumstances, allow its water to be treated like a mere bargaining chip. Trump's demand, though brash and controversial, was not the first time he had targeted Canadian resources. Just weeks earlier, he had imposed sweeping tariffs on steel, lumber, and vehicles, sparking a trade war that sent shockwaves through U.S. industries. Yet, the water demand struck a different chord, one that resonated deeply within Canada and beyond. For the U.S., the consequences of this demand were immediate and multifaceted. Across the western states, the expectation was clear. The American government would somehow negotiate and secure water from Canada. The hope was that this new water supply would alleviate the growing crisis. But what followed was the exact opposite. Carney's refusal to entertain Trump's demand didn't just break the traditional mold of U.S. Canada relations, it shattered it. The issue of water, once a quiet and technical matter managed through long-standing treaties, became the focal point of a geopolitical conflict. In essence, the U.S. was trying to assert control over a resource it believed it had automatic access to. Canada, on the other hand, was making it clear that sovereignty over its water resources was not up for negotiation. As the U.S. continued to pressure Canada for water, farmers in drought-ridden regions like California, Arizona, and Nevada found themselves caught in a bind. They had been promised relief, but instead, they were met with uncertainty. Trump's assurances that Canadian water could save crops, stabilize food prices, and prevent disaster were quickly dispelled when Ottawa's firm stance became clear. Farmers, who already faced hardships due to the ongoing water shortage, now found themselves staring at the harsh reality of more reduced irrigation and a rapidly worsening situation. Projections began to surface, warning that prices for staple crops like lettuce, almonds, and tomatoes could surge by double digits before the year's end. The immediate impact on U.S. agriculture was undeniable, and it was just the beginning. Beyond agriculture, the industrial heartlands of the U.S. were also bracing for a blow. Industries such as semiconductor manufacturing, hydroelectric energy, and other water-dependent sectors in the Pacific Northwest and Midwest were already struggling with water shortages. The idea that Canada's water could provide a lifeline was enticing, but quickly, that hope was dashed as well. In the high-tech sectors, where water is essential for cooling and production processes, analysts were already forecasting production delays. A major semiconductor plant, for example, consumes up to 10 million gallons of water per day. Without the promised Canadian diversion, companies were forced to ration water, cut shifts, and warn of delays that would affect everything from electronics to defense systems. Even the energy sector wasn't immune. Hydroelectric plants, which had relied on steady water flow for power generation, found themselves unable to meet peak demand, forcing them to turn to more expensive and environmentally damaging fossil fuels. This shift was not only bad for the environment but bad for consumers as well, who faced rising energy bills as a result. Meanwhile, the White House tried to frame the situation as a temporary challenge, a small hurdle to overcome in the quest for stability and prosperity. However, the reality was much more complex. Instead of providing relief, Trump's hardline approach had ignited a cascade of problems. It was a situation where aggressive tactics were met with defiance, and the consequences were far-reaching. In Ottawa, environmental and Indigenous groups were sounding the alarm. Over 85 organizations came together, demanding that Canada's freshwater sovereignty be protected at all costs. The message was clear: Canada's water was not for sale. And yet, despite the backlash, Trump pressed on. His rhetoric surrounding the Columbia River became even more pointed. He envisioned the 2-0-kilometer river, of which 800 kilometers flow through British Columbia, as the key to solving America's water crisis. But in freezing updates to the 1961 Columbia River Treaty, Trump made it clear he was willing to abandon decades of cooperation in favor of unilateral control. For Canada, this was a direct attack on its sovereignty. Prime Minister Mark Carney was resolute. He warned that Canada would never allow its rivers to be used as a political tool by a foreign power, no matter how powerful that power was. The impasse set the stage for a global stage showdown, one that would not only define the future of U.S. Canada relations, but also change the way nations think about water, its value, and its role in the geopolitical landscape. The world was watching closely as the standoff between Trump and Carney intensified. The situation had escalated beyond trade wars and tariffs. It was now about control over one of the most essential and dwindling resources in the world: fresh water. In Washington, the pressure was mounting. Trump's demands for Canadian water had been framed as a solution to America's deepening crisis, particularly in the West. The reality, however, was far more complicated. As farmers in drought-stricken states like California were left holding the bag, they began to realize that Trump's promise of relief was nothing more than a hollow hope. Water, once thought to be a resource that could be accessed on demand, was suddenly locked up, and the consequences were unfolding quickly. Agriculture, which accounts for a huge portion of the U.S. economy, was already under significant strain due to the ongoing drought. California, Arizona, and Nevada, key agricultural states, depended heavily on water for irrigation. Trump had promised Canadian water would save their crops and stabilize prices, but that promise fell apart with Carney's firm refusal. For farmers, this was a devastating blow. Crops that needed water to survive were now being left to wither, and it was clear that the situation was going to get worse before it got better. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 40% of America's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts came from California's fields. Without additional water supply, costs were bound to surge. In fact, food prices were already rising in the U.S., with projections of double-digit increases for key staples like lettuce, almonds, and tomatoes by the end of the year. This was only the beginning. The ripple effects of these price hikes would reach into every corner of the economy, from supermarkets to restaurant tables, impacting everyday Americans who were already feeling the weight of rising costs. The agricultural impact was just the tip of the iceberg. Trump had also singled out industries that rely heavily on water, such as semiconductor manufacturing and hydro-dependent industries in the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest. These industries were facing growing uncertainty as water shortages started to bite into their operations. In Arizona, where water is a critical resource for computer chip fabrication, manufacturers began to feel the pressure. A major semiconductor plant, for example, uses up to 10 million gallons of water per day. Without the promised Canadian diversion, many plants found themselves cutting back on production, laying off workers, and bracing for delays that would ripple across entire supply chains. From electronics to military defense systems, every sector that relied on these chips began to feel the effects of water shortages. The energy sector wasn't spared either. Hydroelectric plants that had long relied on consistent water flow to produce power found themselves in a difficult position. With water levels at historic lows, utilities were forced to turn to coal and natural gas plants to meet demand, reversing years of progress in clean energy production. This not only hurt the environment but also increased energy costs for consumers, making the situation even worse. The White House, meanwhile, attempted to spin the situation as a temporary challenge, an issue that could be solved through negotiation. But the truth was that America was facing a serious crisis. Water, once seen as a resource that would always be available from the north, was now in short supply, and the U.S. could not simply bully its way into securing more. Trump's decision to press Canada so aggressively was seen as an attempt to show strength and dominance. He wanted to send a message to the world that the U.S. could assert its power, even over its closest allies. But the reality of his position quickly became clear. Canada was not going to give in. This is where Carney's resolve became even more significant. He didn't just stand firm for the sake of national pride, he was protecting something far more important: Canada's sovereignty over its natural resources. For decades, the U.S. had assumed it could tap into Canada's resources without question. But Carney's refusal was a clear message that those days were over. Canada had its own interests to protect, and those interests didn't include being a resource bank for its southern neighbor. As the situation continued to escalate, the economic ramifications were starting to ripple across the U.S. Not only were farmers and manufacturers facing delays and increased costs, but the entire U.S. economy was starting to feel the strain. In the West, particularly in California, farmers were now having to choose between abandoning their crops or paying skyrocketing costs for water, if they could even get access to it. In the industrial heartlands of Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, where water-dependent industries like steel and auto manufacturing had long been pillars of the U.S. economy, the situation was equally dire. Reduced water access was starting to affect production schedules, and companies were facing higher operating costs due to the scarcity of water. The results were clear: layoffs, production cuts, and rising costs for consumers. And it wasn't just the agricultural and industrial sectors that were impacted. The uncertainty surrounding water security in the U.S. was starting to shake Wall Street as well. Investors, who rely on stable resources to make informed decisions, were starting to treat water security as a risk factor, particularly in industries heavily dependent on water. The agricultural sector saw its stock prices dip sharply after Carney's refusal, and analysts warned that other industries, particularly manufacturing and tech, could be next. For the average American, the consequences of this water dispute were becoming very real. Rising food prices, higher energy bills, and an overall sense of uncertainty were taking their toll. At the same time, the political fallout was just beginning. The White House had promised prosperity through strength, but Trump's failure to secure Canadian water was beginning to reveal weakness. To many, it was no longer a matter of trade agreements and tariffs, it was a matter of survival. The economic and political fallout was now a very real part of the daily lives of millions of Americans. As the standoff continued to unfold, the global impact of the dispute over water became increasingly apparent. What started as a tense but manageable trade issue between two neighboring countries had now morphed into a high-stakes diplomatic showdown that reverberated across the world. The fight over water was not just about resources, it was about power, sovereignty, and the very future of U.S. Canada relations. As Prime Minister Carney held firm, refusing to let Canadian water become a political pawn in Trump's game of leverage, the world watched with growing interest. The outcome of this dispute would send a powerful message about how nations would approach their most valuable resources in the future. For Canada, the refusal to give in to Trump's demands was more than a matter of principle. It was a statement of sovereignty. The message was clear: Canada's water was not up for grabs, and it would not be treated as a commodity to be bartered away to solve America's problems. Carney's response was a reminder that Canada was no longer a passive resource provider for the U.S. It was a nation that would defend its rights, no matter the pressure. But as the political battle continued to intensify, the consequences of this confrontation began to ripple through the broader international community. The U.S. had long been seen as the dominant global power, capable of influencing and controlling key resources. But by demanding Canada's water, Trump had created a situation that made America appear vulnerable, and many around the world took notice. In Europe, where droughts had already begun to affect agriculture, analysts started to look at Canada's water reserves with renewed interest. If the U.S. couldn't guarantee a steady supply of water from its northern neighbor, then Europe might soon find itself in the same position, facing the prospect of climate-induced water scarcity. As a result, some European policymakers began to privately explore the possibility of future trade agreements with Canada that would secure access to its water. It was clear that water was quickly becoming one of the most strategic commodities on the planet. Meanwhile, in Asia, where water scarcity had already become a pressing issue, the situation was being closely monitored. Countries in the Middle East, India, and China were all facing growing concerns about their access to fresh water. For many of these nations, Canada's vast freshwater reserves now represented a potential lifeline in a world where water security was becoming increasingly uncertain. China, in particular, began to quietly position itself as a key player in the global water trade. Diplomatic circles were buzzing with speculation that Chinese companies might soon begin investing in Canadian water management infrastructure, offering capital in exchange for future assurances of water access. This was a significant development, signaling a shift in global power dynamics. But it wasn't just foreign powers that were paying attention to Canada's role in the global water game. The dispute between the U.S. and Canada had shifted the global perception of Canada's value as a resource-rich nation. Once seen as a quiet partner to the U.S., Canada was now emerging as a key player in the geopolitics of water. The Columbia River Treaty, once a symbol of cross-border cooperation, had suddenly become a flashpoint. Signed in 1961, the treaty had helped to balance flood control in the U.S. with Canada's hydroelectric profits. It had been a model of cooperation, one that had rarely made headlines. But now, with Trump freezing updates to the treaty, the decades-long collaboration was in limbo, and the world was paying attention. By pushing Canada to the brink, Trump had inadvertently elevated the country's role on the global stage. No longer just a resource supplier to the U.S., Canada was now seen as a gatekeeper to one of the most critical resources on Earth, and that shift in perception had far-reaching implications for global trade, diplomacy, and security. For the U.S., the consequences of this shift were far from ideal. Trump's approach to water had inadvertently undermined America's position as the dominant global power. By threatening Canada's sovereignty over its water, he had raised doubts about the reliability of American leadership. If the U.S. could not secure basic resources like water from its closest ally, what did that say about its standing in the world? The geopolitical consequences of this standoff were profound. Allies of the U.S. began to question its reliability as a partner. If Washington was willing to threaten Canada over water, what was to stop it from doing the same to other nations in the future? This uncertainty began to erode trust among America's allies, particularly within NATO, where the U.S. had long been seen as a leader in both military and economic matters. In response to the growing crisis, European leaders began to take a more cautious approach toward the U.S. They had long relied on Washington for security and economic stability, but the water standoff with Canada sent a signal that perhaps it was time to explore other avenues of cooperation. As Europe faced its own water shortages, leaders began to consider Canada as a potential partner for future trade agreements, especially in the realm of agricultural water needs. China, always looking for new opportunities to expand its influence, saw in Canada a potential ally in the global resource race. With its vast water reserves and strategic location, Canada was increasingly seen as a crucial player in the emerging geopolitics of water. Meanwhile, back in North America, the political ramifications of the standoff were still being felt. Trump's actions had strained relationships, not just with Canada, but with many other countries. The fallout was evident in the U.S., where the agricultural, manufacturing, and tech sectors were all bracing for the long-term effects of the water crisis. But it was also evident internationally as countries began to recalibrate their strategies for securing access to vital resources. In Canada, Prime Minister Carney's firm stance had united the nation. His refusal to bow to American pressure was seen as a sign of strength and resolve. As the crisis continued to unfold, Carney's leadership was becoming a symbol of Canada's commitment to protecting its sovereignty in the face of external pressure. But for the U.S., the crisis was far from over. The failure to secure Canadian water had exposed vulnerabilities that no amount of tariffs, threats, or economic pressure could fix. The broader message was clear. Canada's water was not just an asset to be taken, it was a sovereign resource that would be defended at all costs. As the confrontation between the U.S. and Canada over water continued to play out, it became clear that this was no longer just a battle between two countries. It was a defining moment in the geopolitics of the 21st century. The dispute was not just about water, it was about control over one of the planet's most precious and dwindling resources. The global implications of the standoff were impossible to ignore. Water, once seen as a readily available resource, was now becoming the most strategic commodity on Earth. Nations were waking up to the reality that the days of taking fresh water for granted were over. In a world increasingly shaped by climate change, water security had become just as important as energy security. For Canada, the refusal to bow to American pressure was a turning point. By standing firm, Prime Minister Carney had not only defended Canada's water sovereignty, but also established the country as a key player in the emerging global water game. No longer just a resource provider for the U.S., Canada had cemented its position as an independent power in its own right. The message was clear. Canada's resources were not up for grabs, and its sovereignty would be protected at all costs. In the U.S., the consequences of this standoff were still being felt. The fallout from Trump's demands had exposed vulnerabilities in America's resource management and raised questions about the future of U.S. leadership on the global stage. Trump's strategy had been to assert control over Canadian water, but in doing so, he had inadvertently weakened the U.S. standing in the world. The economic consequences were already evident. U.S. industries that relied on water, agriculture, manufacturing, tech, and energy had all been affected by the growing uncertainty around water availability. From skyrocketing food prices to production delays, the consequences of the water dispute were now being felt in every corner of the U.S. economy. For American consumers, rising costs and a lack of reliable solutions were becoming a daily reality. But the biggest blow for the U.S. was not just economic, it was geopolitical. Trump's approach to water had undermined trust among America's allies and left the U.S. looking vulnerable on the global stage. The demand for Canada's water had exposed America's reliance on foreign resources, and the failure to secure those resources had made it clear that the U.S. was not as invulnerable as it had once believed. Countries around the world were taking notice, and many were rethinking their relationships with the U.S. In Europe and Asia, countries that were already grappling with their own water crises began to look to Canada as a potential strategic partner. Europe, which had long relied on the U.S. for security and economic stability, was now quietly courting Canada. European leaders began to discuss the possibility of future trade agreements that would secure access to Canadian water resources, especially for agricultural needs. In Asia, where water scarcity was already a growing concern, China and other nations began to see Canada's vast freshwater reserves as a critical resource for the future. China, in particular, began exploring ways to invest in Canada's water management infrastructure, signaling a shift in global power dynamics. In the Arctic, where the effects of climate change were opening up new shipping routes and resource fields, Canada found itself in a stronger position. The dispute with the U.S. had not only protected Canada's water resources, but had also reinforced the country's determination to defend its sovereignty in the Arctic. As the ice receded and new opportunities emerged, Canada's role as a gatekeeper to these resources became increasingly important, and with the U.S. distracted by its water dispute, other nations, particularly China and Russia, were paying close attention to how Canada would navigate these new challenges. For the U.S., the failure to secure Canadian water had raised the stakes for its future. Climate change was already exacerbating water shortages across the country, and the lack of a reliable water supply from Canada only made the situation worse. The U.S. would have to find new ways to address its water crisis, either through technological innovation or domestic conservation. But these solutions were costly and would take time. In the meantime, the U.S. remained exposed to the growing uncertainty surrounding its water supply. The political fallout from the water standoff was also mounting. As the situation dragged on, pressure from U.S. industries, farmers, and consumers was mounting. The question on everyone's mind was, how would the U.S. government respond? Would it escalate the situation with tariffs, legal challenges, or even unilateral diversion projects. Each option carried risks, and none of them seemed like a clear path to success. The longer the standoff continued, the more damage it would cause to the U.S. economy, its global standing, and its relationships with its allies. For Canada, the path forward was clearer. By refusing to cave to U.S. demands, Carney had set a precedent that would be hard to reverse. The idea that Canada's water was not a bargaining chip had become entrenched in Canadian politics. No future leader could afford to backtrack on this issue, especially as the country looked to deepen its ties with other global powers, including Europe and Asia. With new federal protections for water sovereignty expected to be introduced, Canada was positioning itself as a leader in the geopolitics of water. The future, however, would not be without challenges. Canada's success in defending its water resources would depend on how well it could manage its own water supply in the face of increasing demand. As global water scarcity intensified, Canada would have to balance its national interests with its growing role in the global water market. At the same time, the U.S. would have to adapt to a new reality, one where its access to water was no longer guaranteed and where competition for this essential resource was only going to increase. The struggle over water was not just a dispute between two countries, it was a sign of things to come. In the 21st century, nations would have to rethink their approach to resources, sovereignty, and security. Water, once considered a limitless resource, was now becoming a flashpoint for conflict, cooperation, and new alliances. For both the U.S. and Canada, the outcome of this confrontation would shape the future of North America and the world. And as the global struggle for water continues to unfold, one thing is certain: the world is watching, and the decisions made today will echo for generations to come.